A very good evening to each one of you. Welcome to our Bible study. If you have your Bibles, kindly turn with me to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. I remember when I was in the fourth standard, there was this English teacher that I had. Her name was Mrs. Lobo. This was in Clarence High School. And I remember there was this one lesson called Raja Boje. I don't know if you all also had similar lessons. I'm sure if you went through Clarence, you might remember this name Raja Boje, a familiar character. I can't even remember what the story is about or anything like that, except there was this one test that I took where it was true or false. So you have to tell whether the statement is true or false. And this teacher, Mrs. Lobo, said something in that statement, that true or false statement, that reminded me of something that all of us had read in our textbook. So it was something like Raja Boje was sitting by the pond, and that statement was true, except that instead of putting Raja Boje, she put some other name. And so when I read it, I didn't read it so carefully that I realized that she had just changed the name. So it was true that Raja Boji was sitting by the pond, but she just changed that one word. And so I read it very quickly and I just wrote true. And then because of that, I couldn't get 100 on 100 because that was actually a false statement because she changed the name. So I went and I asked her about it. Even when I read it, I didn't realize why she had marked it wrong. Then she said it wasn't Raja Boje who was sitting by the pond, and she pointed it out. And she said something to the effect of, "I'm quite cunning," or "I'm tricky, am I not?" or something like that. I remember. And I remember thinking to myself how challenging these tests could be. And that is my little fourth standard mind thinking that they make it really, really hard. They make it really challenging for you to get 100 on 100. Now, I begin with that because Abraham is going to face a test, an exam, which is way, way more challenging than what I just described. This is a monumental challenge, a monumental test, very challenging times for Abraham in Genesis chapter 22 because it begins by saying that God himself tested him. I mean, you can imagine if you got a text message saying, on such and such a day, between this time and this time, God is going to test you. How would that cause us to feel? What kind of emotions would that evoke? So, eh, what's important to know is that in Genesis 22, the test doesn't produce faith in Abraham. The test reveals the faith that is already in Abraham. It's not producing some new kind of faith. It's not meant to manufacture faith, but it's just revealing the faith that already exists within him. So, verse 1 starts with by saying, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had." Sorry, that is Genesis 21, Genesis 22 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." So it says God tested. The Hebrew word is nasa, which means to prove value. And Abraham immediately said, when God said Abraham, he immediately said, "Here I am." So when I was reading that, I was just thinking about these times when there have been times, I admit there have been times when I'm in the house, maybe I'm tired, maybe I've already left the room, and I still heard, say, somebody in my family close to me call to me. And sometimes there's this question, did they call me or did I hear something? But you just choose to ignore it anyways. You just go out and say, if it's really important, they'll call me again, and you're not sure. Sometimes you heard it, but you think it's okay, you'll come back and figure out later, and you're already on your way. I can recollect such times where I heard my name being called and yet I just ignored it. But here you see the willingness of Abraham. He there's no second thought. The minute God says Abraham, he says, "Here I am," and he presents himself as a diligent servant because of his walk thus far with God. He's had his ups and downs, and God has molded him and shaped him. And so he's really ready, he's really willing. He presents himself, he says, "Here I am," in the first verse of 22. Then in 22:2, he said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac." and whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And you can imagine Abraham's emotions when he first heard this. It's been a long time. You might remember we started Abraham's story in at the end of Genesis 11. That's where we're introduced to Abraham. We're in chapter 22. Many years have elapsed, possibly 25, 26 years have elapsed from the time we introduced to him. And his name was first Abraham, exalted father. Then God changes his name to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. All the ups and downs he's been through. We've meditated on all these scriptures, all the things that he went through, all the times God shaped him, rebuked him, the times he lied about Sarah, all those different things he's been through this really long journey of faith with its ups and downs, mountaintops and times in the valley. And here he is. If you remember Genesis 21, it's happy days because Isaac is born, Yitzhak is born. There's laughter in the house, and at the end of 21, it says he dwelt in the land of the Philistines for many years. Or let me just read it. It says sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. Many commentators say many years have elapsed between 21 and 22, and Isaac is all grown up now. And so there have been a lot of joys, a lot of joy, they have gone for walks, they have eaten good food. He's enjoying the fact that he's finally had his own son with his own wife Sarah. And now God says in verse 2, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. And sometimes you wonder why God allows certain tests like this. And we always wonder why he allows certain tests like that. There's a Yiddish proverb that says God sends burdens, but he also sends shoulders to bear these burdens. He sends burdens, but he also sends shoulders to bear the burdens. So there was this tiny plant which was really small and stunted in the forest. And next to it stood this mighty oak tree, this massive oak tree. And the plant was so happy that it was so close to this mighty oak tree, and it believed that its security came from this oak tree, its strength, its identity came from this oak tree. It was really comfortable. The small, stunted, tiny plant was really comfortable because it was next to this massive plant, this massive oak tree. But there came a time when a woodcutter came and he laid the axe to the tree, and he started cutting down this massive oak tree. And then the tiny plant screamed, saying, if you remove that, then I'll be destroyed. I mean, the winds will come down, the rains will come down. And the woodcutter told the tiny plant that when I remove this oak tree, the sun will get you, the rains will come to you, and then you won't stay stunted anymore, but you will grow up to be a mighty plant yourself or a mighty tree yourself. And often God allows tests in our life, challenges in our life, so that we continue to grow in our faith. So our faith is proven. So that's what's pretty much happening here in verse 2. God says, take your only son. Now, in the Quran, sometimes they say that, I mean, of course, majority of the Muslims believe that the son that is being referred to over here is Ishmael and not Isaac. And it's not mentioned in the Quran, but in the 37th chapter, verse 102, and there it's called surahs, not chapters. So in the 37th chapter, the story is presented slightly differently. So Abraham, the father, says, I've had a dream where I have sacrificed you. And he tells the dream to his son. There it's assumed many of the Muslims believe that it is Ishmael. And so he says, I had this dream where I sacrifice you. And the son responds, do as God has commanded. Hopefully, or God willing, you will find me steadfast. That's there in Surah 37, 102. So the Muslims say when he says only son, the only son that he had was Ishmael, and so is thing. But we know, and of course, the question comes: why does God say take your only son when in fact Abraham had two sons, Ishmael firstborn through Hagar, and number two Isaac through Sarah. Hebrews 11, if you look at Hebrews 11, that's in the New Testament, it says Hebrews 11, 7 to 19 says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. So again, in the book of Hebrews, it qualifies this concept of the only son. So Isaac was the only begotten son. He, in a sense, he was the only unique son of Abraham. And in the Greek, the word is monogenes or monogenes, which is Greek for begotten. If you look at the BDAG, which is the Bible dictionary of ancient Greek, there are two things. There are two meanings of this word monogenes. Number one is pertaining to being the only one of its kind within a specific relationship. This is the meaning in Hebrews 11:17 when it's referring to Isaac being the begotten son of Abraham. That is pertaining to being the only one of its kind within a specific relationship between Sarah and Abraham. Isaac was their unique son, their begotten son. So Isaac was Abraham's only begotten son in this first sense, but there's a second sense, the word monogenes, and that is pertaining to being the only one of its kind or class, unique in its kind. In this sense, we're referring to example would be John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, because Jesus was for Jesus the second definition applies, which is pertaining to being the only one of its kind or class. In that sense, Jesus was completely unique. The Hebrew word again over here in Genesis chapter 22, verse 2, only is the word Yachid, which means unique, your unique son. That means your son according to the covenant that I've made with you. You remember that Abraham said, may Ishmael live before you, and God said no. And in fact, in just the previous chapter, in Genesis 21:12, he says, through Isaac your offspring shall be named. And so as far as the covenant is concerned, Isaac is the only son. He's the only unique son. And a little bit of common sense as well. That is Genesis 21. Ishmael leaves with his mother Hagar. God provides for them and takes care of them. But right now, Isaac is the only son in the house, so it could be just that. Take your only son, that whom you love. Sometimes people say, "Oh, it's thing of only son whom you love," so he did not love Ishmael. And I don't think so. I think Abraham did love Ishmael as well. That's why he was so distressed when Sarah said, send them out. So I don't think it's a question of loving, and I don't think that answer is accurate. I just think as far as the covenant is concerned, and this is further strengthened by Galatians chapter 4, where Paul gives that picture that Ishmael is a picture of the works of the flesh, and Isaac is a picture of the works of grace or faith. So it can't be a mixture. So as far as the covenant is concerned, Abraham has only one son, and that is Isaac. And so he says, take your son whom you love, your only son whom you love. Genesis is a book of first mentions. You have so many words in the book of Genesis that is mentioned for the first time in the Bible. This is no exception. The word love here is mentioned for the first time in the Bible. And interestingly, it's in the context of a father and a son, which again, I mean, if you probably already know this, but Genesis 22 is just a foreshadowing of the greatest sacrifice to come. And again, that love, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. There was love between God the Father and God the Son. John, in the Gospel of John, though, it talks about how Jesus was in face-to-face relationship with the Father. He had this intimate relationship with the Father. And even here, the first time the word love is mentioned, it's in the context of a father and son relationship, which is the kind of relationship God has with his son. And so that is an example of the law of first mention. So the law of first mention is basically when you look up a biblical concept and see where it first appears in the Bible, and then you draw out the meaning from that. It is not always helpful, the law of first mention, because there are some challenges, like whether you see where it first appears chronologically or whether it first appears in the Bible, those kind of challenges. But many Bible students will look up the law of first mention. If you want to know the importance of blood, you look up the first mention of blood, Cain and Abel, and God says, well, your brother's blood is crying out from the ground, which then tells us that blood equals life, and this is further strengthened in Leviticus and so on. So first mention sometimes is helpful when you want to understand the concept. Where does it first appear in the Bible, and how is the word used? What does it teach us about that use? Sometimes it can be helpful to use that hermeneutic. So here, the first time love is mentioned is between the context of a father and a son, and he says to him in verse 2, go to the land of Moriah. And obviously, I'll speed up as we go along. Always spend time in the first, more time in the first few verses to lay the foundation. So he says, take him to the land of Moriah. What is interesting about Moriah is it's nothing but it's Jerusalem basically. And if you in Second Chronicles 3:1, it says, then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So Jerusalem is Mount Moriah, and that's where later the city of Jerusalem is, and that's obviously where Jesus also died, and that's in that same region. So he says, offer him as a burnt offering doesn't mean that Isaac was going to be burnt alive. It means that he was first going to be sacrificed and then he would be lit up. So it's not that he was going to be burnt alive. Just wanted to clarify that. Verse 3 goes on to say, so Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Now, Soren Kierkegaard, in his book Fear and Trembling, which is basically a detailed look at Genesis chapter 22, talks about how Abraham was so obedient to God and his faith was at an all time high that he rose up. Even when God said, sacrifice your son, he rose up. Verse 3, early in the morning, he saddled his donkey and he took two of his younger men and he starts cutting the wood. And he talks about, being a poet, a philosopher. He says this is not just an arbitrary detail that's been added. There's meaning to even the phrase. So Abraham rose early in the morning. But actually, I think what is more truthful in this whole setting, understanding the emotions of a father, is he probably had a sleepless night and he was tossing and turning and he was wondering, God, how could you allow this? I mean, how could you tell me to sacrifice son? And therefore, he rose early in the morning, and in spite of being a wealthy man, having so many servants, he cuts the wood himself. He's probably, I mean, he not probably, he is an older man right now, so he could have delegated the responsibility to one of his servants to cut the wood, but he himself picks up the axe and he starts chopping the wood. And the reason is probably because he wanted to get his mind off everything, and he's doing some manual labor, and he's all this nervous energy. I remember listening to R.C. Sproul, who talks about this very passage, and he tells the story of how he had a teacher, a piano teacher in his seminary, and this teacher was a very kind lady, very sensitive lady, and she had a son who she was very proud of. Always be talking about all his accomplishments. Her son was both a missionary and a physician, and he would go and serve in different places. He would spread the gospel and he would tend to people's all their ailments and so on, because he was also a doctor. So when the son got married and had his first child, his grandmother, who was the piano teacher of R.C. Sproul, the theologian, was really proud and was very proud of this beautiful child that they had. Always showed pictures and all that. But there was one time when the father was doing his duties and he was tending to a patient, and the child came and opened the medicine bag of the father, who is a doctor, his medical kit, and took some medicine by mistake, thinking that it was candy or some sweet, and unfortunately died because of it. When the father came back and saw the child, she had already ingested this medicine and she had passed away. So when the news came to the grandmother, she was absolutely heartbroken, as you can imagine. That's the piano teacher, and R.C. Sproul was there that evening or maybe a couple of days later to take piano lessons. And when she told him the story, even he wept, she wept, and he asked her, "How is it? How is it that you can deal with this trauma? How is it that you deal with all this pain?" And she just said that the more the more I think about that incident, the more time I spend at the piano. And she said, "Oh, the soul that comes from within I mean, rather, this pain that comes from within my soul flows through my arms, through my fingers, out of my fingers, and into the keys of that piano." So Sproul basically concludes saying that Abraham wasn't. It's not that he was just so excited to follow through with the commandments of God or something like that. He probably had a rough night. He probably gets up and he has all this adrenaline, wondering why God is asking him to do it. Yes, he's going to follow through, but he's arranging the wood himself. He's doing all the manual labor himself, and so instead of him in this context playing the piano, he picks up the axe and he starts chopping wood. Verse 4 says, on the third day, eh, because he starts going to the place where God told him on the third day, again, foreshadowing something that points to the greater sacrifice. On the third day, we know that Jesus rose again from the grave. So on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and he saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Sorry, I just keep muting everybody in between so that because there's some disturbance coming. So, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he took it in his hand, the fire and the knife. They went both of them together, and Isaac said, okay, I've already read that. Verse 8 says, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. On the third day, as I said, an allusion to what is to come. If you look at verse 5, it says that Abraham told his servants to stay with the donkey, the young men to stay with the donkey. And he says, I will go over with the boy and worship. Even in this context, when he's probably in agony of soul, he's still saying, he's still telling his servants, I'm going to go there to worship, which is a good reminder to us that when we go through stuff, a good, an apt, and appropriate, in fact, a helpful response would be to worship God even through the suffering by offering Him the sacrifice of praise. And he says, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back again to you. So he says that we will come back in spite of God asking him to sacrifice his son. There is Abraham, not declares, but he has this faith where he says that we will return to you. So the insight that we're given according to the book of Hebrews is that Abraham believed that even though he would sacrifice Isaac, that God is able to raise him from the dead. That is, that we're given an insight into the mind of Abraham. That's the faith, that's the kind of faith that he had. He was going to follow through on God's instructions. He probably had many questions as to why God was asking this of him. But he believed that even if he sacrificed Isaac, God would raise him back, bring him back to the death. And in that sense, according to the book of Hebrews, he figuratively received him back from the dead, is what Hebrews 11:19 says. So, verse 5, he has that faith. He says, we both will return together. And of course, that displays tremendous faith. Again, just because Genesis, the book of first mentions, the word worship first appears over here in this context. So, and then then in verse 6, verse 6 says, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. If you saw in verse 5, he says, I and the boy. The Hebrew word for boy is a flexible term. It's the same word as young men. It can refer to a toddler. It can refer to a grown man, which is why I think it's safe to say that Isaac is not a little boy over here. He's probably a young man, probably a teenager. Some Jewish scholars even say he was maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. Some people, I think Adam Clark says he was 33 years old and all that. That is obviously to do with the age of Jesus when he was crucified. But I think the most reasonable explanation, or the best way to understand it, is he was probably in his teens or early 20s, given all the calculations as to when Sarah had him, when he was weaned, when Sarah died, and all those things. But there are some clues as well. For example, he asks, where is the sacrifice? If you look at verse 7, which we've not yet come to, he asks his father, where is the sacrifice? So he has enough sense to know that the wood and the fire is there, but the sacrifice is missing. Of course, even a child, if he saw this a number of times, would have realized this. But then, even in the phrases, if you remember how Genesis chapter 21 ends, which says, many days in the land of the Philistines. And then in 22:1, it says, after all these things that happened, many believe that many years have elapsed. Many commentators believe that many years have elapsed during this time. So Isaac would have grown up basically. And as I said, the word boy, young man, all interchangeable. In fact, it's the same word that's used over here when in verse 5, Abraham says to his young men, and the word boy, it's the same word. So it can be young man, it can be boy. But then, of course, I think one of the most telling clues in Genesis 22:6, which we're going to read, it says that Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. The wood would have been quite heavy. In fact, that would have been the heaviest thing to carry up the mountain, walk all the way uphill. And if he was a 5-year-old boy, it would have been very taxing for him and would have been very cruel of his father to make him carry such a heavy load. But he was probably much stronger than that because he was in his teens or he was older. And so he was the one, not Abraham. Abraham was 100 years old. Yes, he's older. But given the fact that he lived to 175, I don't think he was that weak either. So, but yet the choice to carry the wood is Isaac. And so by looking at all these different clues in the passage, we can understand that Isaac was not a small boy. That word boy is flexible. So verse 6 also, twice it will come in verse 6 and I think verse 9. But verse 6, it says that they went up together. In verse 6, at the very end, it says, both of them together. So they went, both of them together. And the idea here, when you look at the original languages, they were in agreement in what they did. They were going up in unison. There was no difference of opinion. There was no conflict of interest. They both were with one mind, they went up. So in verse 7, he has a genuine question. He asks the most logical thing. He says, I see the fire, I see the wood, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says something prophetic. He says, God will provide. And again, they're together, they're in agreement. That's how it ends. God will provide. And then in verse 9, let me read it for you. It says, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Interesting verse because I just talked about how Isaac most probably was a grown up here, and yet he doesn't try to retaliate, doesn't try to put up a fight. I mean, if he suddenly at the last minute found out that he is the sacrifice, there is no lamb, there is no animal that's going to be sacrificed, he is the sacrifice. You can imagine the adrenaline that's pumping through his veins, how his heart must have been beating fast when his father makes him lie down on the altar and ties him up and says, you are the sacrifice. When he figures out the obvious, how his mental frame would have been, he could have fought back, he could have pushed off, probably was stronger than his aged father, aged father, so his older father now. So his father is more than 100 years old, yet he doesn't retaliate. So often we commend Abraham for his faith and says he followed through, and yes, he has to be commended. But what about Isaac's faith in all this? And it's possibly because Isaac realizes that if this is what God requires of us, then he has to go through with it. Yes, it might have been traumatic and all that. I don't want to make it like as if he was very calm about it. Probably was very traumatic, but he probably realizes that if this is what God requires of them, then he's going to go through with it. And add to that the fact that this practice was actually a very common practice in that culture, the Canaanite culture, where they would sacrifice their children. And so maybe Isaac thought, this is what God requires of me, that I be a sacrifice. Maybe this is for the greater good, and I can't question this. But no doubt at least as far as I see it, it would have been a traumatic experience for him when he figured out that he is the sacrifice. So verse 10 says, then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son. He probably stretched it above him, and that's how all the pictures portrayed. He's ready to pierce his son, ready to stab him, ready to sacrifice him, and then burn him. So we see in verse 11 that the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and told went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So God tested Abraham, but God all the while knew that he wasn't going to allow Abraham to go through with the sacrifice. And yet we see through all this that he was completely willing. We saw earlier Hebrews 11. He his belief was that even if he went through the sacrifice, if he slaughtered Isaac, that God is capable of raising him from the dead, and he knows for a fact that God has already promised him that through Isaac your offspring will be named. And if you looked at any of his past encounters, and that's an encouragement to us, look to the past encounters to see how God has come through, so that we have enough faith to walk, in the future into the unknown. So, of course, some questions come up. Questions like, why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice to do something sinful? We know that God is against murder and stuff like that. So, how did God ask him to do something sinful like that, like murder or sacrifice his own son? I think what's helpful to understand is that, what's helpful to understand this command of God is to see that God is the one who asked Abraham to do this. When he commands later, he talks about them not taking the lives of others. But God gives, God takes away, God takes away. He has the right to do these kind of things because he'll never do something that is contrary to his nature. And in this case, he's asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. It's like somebody gave this analogy. It's like if the law, because if you think of all the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which says that you cannot offer your children as a sacrifice, you'll be wondering why God is asking Abraham to do this. It's like imagine a red light. The law is that the red light means you can't proceed, you can't cross that light. But imagine then a policeman is standing over there and he says, no, 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 come, you can cross this red light as well. And because of his authority at that point, who are you going to listen to if you were standing in front of a red light? Are you going to point to the red light, or are you going to say, oh, he's giving me a pass so I can go? I think we'll listen to the policeman over there. And that in some way, even though not perfectly, helps us to understand what God was doing. This was the exception. God was testing this man. So we cannot say that today, I'll be going around killing people rather in the name of God. There's a huge difference between killing people in the name of God and God telling you to kill somebody. And another thing is, question arises, well, so if maybe somebody will ask me, so if God tells you to kill somebody, will you kill somebody then? I think the answer is God will never ask us to kill somebody because of his law. So he's not going to contradict something that he says in his law. And I would conclude that if God told me to kill somebody, that's not really God, because he would not contradict his word. That is just probably some evil voice telling it, because there are people who have claimed such things. There is a man who's acted out this entire sacrifice and is in jail now. He thought that God told him to reenact this entire sacrifice, and he's sitting in jail now for that. So there are crazy people like that, but God would not contradict his word. He says now, and in fact, this entire incident, if you look at it, it's to show that God doesn't allow child sacrifices because of what he says next to. Let me read that verse for you. He said, because of what he says in verse 12, he says, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son. Don't lay your hand on the boy, don't do anything to him. And then later on, of course, when Moses comes along, it's there in the law as well, where you cannot offer sacrifices, you cannot offer your sons, you cannot offer your daughters as sacrifices. Then, so that's that question: why did God, how did God, ask for something that he later forbids? It's only because he is God and because he has the authority, and this is the exception, and it's to prove his faith. Then that kind of gives way for another question, which is, if God knows everything, then why did he ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? If God knows that Abraham will pass the test with flying colors, and he can see the future, and he knows the thoughts and intentions of man, then why would he ask Abraham to go through the sacrifice? Why he go through this traumatic ordeal for Isaac and for Abraham and all that? And The answer is I have to. I'm not going to take the position of open theism, which says God does not know the future. Of course, He knows the future. If you look, there are plenty of scriptures to say He knows the end from the beginning. He's outside of time, so He knew. There's no. I mean, you have to admit that God knew the outcome even of this test, where He's testing Abraham and saying, "Sacrifice his son." But the reason He does that is number one for Abraham himself to prove his faith. Abraham wouldn't have known, or this is to cause Abraham to grow. That's number one, to for Abraham himself to see how he would react in those kind of situations. Of course, all the heavenly hosts are watching, everybody's watching. Yeah, another reason is for us to know that Abraham has been tested this way and he's passed with flying colors. It's an encouragement to us, but it's also for God, if you think about it, to reward him justly. I mean, I was just writing, I just wrote in my book. Imagine instead of this whole Genesis chapter 22, instead of this whole ordeal where Abraham is really tested, it's not some hypothetical situation or something. He's really tested, he's really put through the fire, he really goes through their emotions, he really would have had a sleepless night, he really was about to live the night. All this is true. Imagine it just instead of Genesis chapter 22, it read something like this, where it says, I know, God says, I know if I asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, he would be willing to do so. Therefore, I will reward him, and therefore, you're going to be a father of all nations. And that's all Genesis 22 was, where God says, I know, hypothetically speaking, if I tested Abraham, he would pass with flying colors. Instead, we have this very real account where God really tests him so that we can see how he did, how he would have gone through, experience those emotions, and yet we sometimes forget while we ask all these questions that God eventually prevented him from killing his son. He didn't allow him to go. If he did, then we'd have many more questions about this fairly strange episode in the Bible where Abraham is tested in this manner. But the fact of the matter, the end result is that God doesn't allow him to go through with the sacrifice. And again, that's a foreshadowing of the future, a time where the knife will not stop. There are so many similarities, as you probably noticed. The 3 days, they both go up. Isaac carries the wood. We know that Jesus carried his own wood, the cross. He goes the patibulum. He carries it. He goes, and we know also that there are so many other similarities between this story and the thing. But in the story of Jesus, God does not provide another ram caught in the thicket. The knife does come down, and all this is a foreshadowing of, even in verse 8, I think Abraham says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. The question right through the Old Testament was, who is that lamb who is going to take away the entire sin? And we know that in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, John the Baptist says, here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the whole world. So finally, Jesus, in the fullness of time, comes, and he is that sacrificial lamb who will die. Every other sacrifice was pointing to that. And even this whole episode is a prophetic reenactment, so that other things will make sense when we read it, right? Even through the prophets, when we read and everything makes sense when you look at it in light of this passage. So he allows Abraham to go through this for as an example for each one of us. So, and that verse, that part which says God says, now I know that you fear me. Sometimes people say, so God did not know before this. But again, that Hebrew word yada, which means to know, it could mean a factual knowledge where God knows factually, and now he's saying, I know experientially. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not that he didn't know theoretically or factually that Abraham would pass the test with flying colors. I believe that God knows even counterfactual, so that even in a given situation, God will know what we'll do in a hypothetical situation. So God would have definitely known the outcome of this test. But here he says, Yada, I know. And we know sometimes that word to know is also used in that context when a husband knows his wife. So here he's saying, I have intimate knowledge, I have experiential knowledge of what exactly you did. I know you're going to pass the test. I know exactly what you did, but now I know experientially as well. And so he proves his faith. Now the story goes on, and we'll finish out this chapter, just a few more verses. Story goes on to say, that the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose, and together they went to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now again, he says, "I will surely bless you, I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, because you have done this." That's how he starts it. So if he did not do it, then imagine God saying, in a hypothetical scenario in my mind, because I know the future, and I know that you are going to go, if I tested you in this way, you will pass the sacrifice. Therefore, I will surely multiply you, as he says over here. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. It won't make much sense to us. The only way all this makes sense is because he really went through that test and he really passed. He really was about to sacrifice Isaac, believing, as we're given that insight later in Hebrews 11, that God is able to raise him from the dead. That's the only thing that made sense to Abraham, because God previously told him, through Isaac, your offspring will be named. The only way that promise can come to pass, and Abraham knows all God's promises. By now, he's come to that place in his life where he knows all God's promises will come to pass. And so the only way that it can happen is if Isaac has children. Obviously, at this point, he's not had children. And so Abraham believes that even though God is asking for something which seems outrageous, he has some faith that God will make a way for him. And in his mind, he thought God will resurrect Isaac after he has sacrificed him. That's what Abraham thought. But what actually happened was that God stopped the sacrifice midway before he put that knife into his chest or into his stomach. So because of that, he is going to be rewarded. So one of the reasons for this test, because of this test, he is going to be rewarded. And it's the same thing with us as well. We go through so many tests and we know the outcome. And so we could make that argument that God already knows the future. So why he has to put me through the test? Several reasons. One is he'll reward us. One is he'll shape us. One is we go through that, we learn to depend on him. We become stronger, like that story that I started off with the small plant and the oak tree. Sometimes he removes that oak tree, removes that sense of security, so that there's a dependence on him, and causing us to grow. So then it ends off, the chapter ends off. Now, after these things, it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Hesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These eight Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Remuah, bore Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Maakah. So all these verses to point to the fact, the reason why all this is given to us, because it's kind of a setup, it's kind of an introduction to Rebekah, who will later marry Abraham's son Isaac. So we're given a little bit, uh, given some idea as to where her family and where she comes from. It was through Abraham's brother back, and it was Abraham's brother Nahor. So that's how the chapter ends. Monumental chapter in the Bible, a very important chapter that foreshadows the cross and the ultimate sacrifice that Jesus carried out on our behalf, or rather, God carried out on our behalf, and Jesus willingly laid down his life for each one of us. So you probably see some other similarities in this text as well, which I'd love to hear, or any other insights from Genesis chapter 22, any other questions that you might have, please feel free to raise and unmute and share your thoughts. That's Genesis 22, 1 to 24.